Good evening, everyone. This is again, Don't Give Up Ukraine. Today you have to do it with Orysya and me. This is basically our 25th broadcast already. And my name is Ruud. I'm a philosopher living in the Netherlands. And you, Orysya?
And I'm a philosopher living in Lviv, Ukraine. Today we are talking about 10 books that we find interesting and useful to understand the current situation that happens today, the war between Ukraine and Russia. And we chose them because they are, as we believe, as what we read, they help us to understand processes that are internal to this war, and some of the things that maybe caused it, or some ones that belong to the very nature of the war. So the first book is the book by a Russian sociologist, a journal. Well, actually, he is also a journalist by education. He used to be a professor at the Faculty of Social Sciences at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. Right now, he's not anymore, of course. And his book, I put here two of the covers of this book. One is in Russian, another one is in English. Both of them have a little bit of irony. The first one is called The Return of the Russian Leviathan. And the other one is called The Park of the Crimea Period. And it has certain allusions to the movie, how you call this? The Park of the Jurassic Period, right?
Jurassic Park, yes.
Jurassic Park, right? Because this is a Crimea period. That is Medvedev defines the events in Crimea as some kind of a marker for what is happening in Russia. It's a kind of turning point, and a subtitle for that book is The Chronicles of the Third Period, and that is the third period of Putin's presidency. So what is interesting about this book? As I mentioned, it's very satirical. Sergei Medvedev has a good sense of humor, so he thinks of, but also it's a kind of dramatic satirical thing, because on one hand, he understands that he lives in a period of Russian history when Russia becomes a real monster, this biblical creature Leviathan that Hobbes was describing the state as, you know, as inevitable fate of any state is to become this huge monster that will take care of the society to set it in order. But in the case of the Russian society, this Leviathan is actually puts its fingers or its huge legs in every single area of a single sphere of the human life, from the most private to the most sociable, most public. And Medvedev thinks about the reason that made it happen, the war that made it happen. He thinks that the most unexpected transformation of the country happened between 2012 and 2018. Although I have to mention that this book was published in 2018, therefore he could not see how it's going to develop further. But he says that the Russian state waged the war in 4 different versions. The first version of the war is the war for the space. Then the war for symbols, that's the second, the war for body, and the war for memory. I'll try to explain what that means. For the space, that means that the authorities are actually fighting again the protesters, protest movement. They had even there are different moments like this but the space is the Crimea. Actually, when they entered Crimea, then they entered Donbass, and now they entered Ukraine. And they entered also Syria, right? So that, and also here I want to say something about moment about that author, that he had a conflict with Putin himself, direct conflict, only once, but that cost him his career. His grandfather was in Gulag twice. And he is very skeptical about the Russian Empire as such, about the Russian state as such. And he said something once publicly, something like this, that we own the Arctic, but we should really give away to the Arctic to the international community, because we are such bad hosts that is actually the ecology and the land is becoming deteriorated, and we have to admit we cannot have it, because we really don't know what to do with this. And Putin was very appalled by his statement, and he said something like, this idiot that actually says about Arctic, we have to conquer more Arctic. We have to get even there more to let everybody know that we can do this. That was the moment when when Medvedev left his university because of this statement, this direct confrontation with the president. Second is the war for symbols, and in the symbolic language, that is military parades, that is this showing of these nuclear muscles, the patriotic parks that they have. There's even the popular T-shirts that everyone wears around with the Soviet symbols. Well, how funny is that? I mean, to wear symbols of the country that does not exist like for 30 years anymore, as if it's something that you belong to. Then there is the war for the body, and that's sure connotation with the Michel Foucault, right? Biopolitics. The war for the body in Russia is the war with the gay propaganda. It's the war against foreign adoptions. I don't know if you're aware, but there is a popular myth going on that foreigners who adopt Russian children want to do something bad for the Russian people, and they either take them for organs, or they bring up in the anti-Russian manner, but all kinds of things. Then Russian Western, the Russia fight Western products, Western food. There was a funny moment when they dig like 7 tons of the cheese that was from abroad. I think it was actually Dutch cheese or something. I'm not sure, but could be Dutch cheese, right? So they didn't let this cheese to be eaten by poor people, or it was not taken anywhere. It was just like they dig a huge hole and just put it in the air, because they thought that it should not go to anybody. And then and there is the war for memory, and war for memory is probably something that we all know, because this is a war for the Soviet heritage. It's the war for May 9, the victory day, and that's specifically the victory day of the Soviet Union over the German Nazism, as if nobody else participated ever in that war. Then it's a myth of Russian history, and I don't know if you're aware, but since I think 2014, or maybe a little bit somewhere at that moment, in Russia now there is an official law that if you are an historian and you say something that goes against the general line of history, something that you find as a historian, as a scholar, you find something that contradicts the ideological line of the history, you can be taken into prison for that. Mm. That is a real case, it's a real official thing. Mm. And so this forward that Russia started actually for Medvedev are the words that mark. He calls this. I will quote you: "History repeats itself twice. What is happening today in Crimea, we could add here, what is happening today in Ukraine, is the final act of Russia's imperial drama, which is a tragic comic way is eliminating its Soviet legacy. It's somewhat frightening to observe this exorcism when the Kremlin has breathed the cold of the grave and the spirit of the past has arisen. But this is just a wild and unrealistic chimera, shadows, a superficial simulacrum, be it of rusty Cossacks or Orthodox bikers. Right now in Russia, it's a night time. We simply have to wait for the cock to crow for the third time." So this is really, I think, it's a great book to understand Russia actually from the inside, with the eyes of the Russian professor.
Yeah, it seems very interesting in that, and in that sense. Did he say anything about why war? Yeah, so he describes these four types of war, but where comes this language of war from? So,
well, the war is actually it's this engine of the Leviathan. You can be huge and threatening only by starting the war. War is this internal spirit, so to say, of the Russian Empire.
Yeah, because in Hobbes, as you know, the war, the Leviathan makes an end to war. So it's the war of all against all, and then we get the social contract, and that creates a civic peace, so to say. And I'm just wondering if this is also about using the type of war and the Leviathan that letting the world war go outside in Ukraine and in Crimea, and now, of course, in the east of Ukraine, is also a kind of strategy of creating the inner peace, so to say. But
yeah, it's some kind of reverse logic of the Russian world. It's this book is a lot about the reverse side of this Russian looking forward by looking back.
Looking forward, like the future of history is our next book. So it's basically being captive in history, so to say, and this repeats itself. Okay, let's go to the next one. So this is one of the first I started reading when the war began. I already had the books for some time in my book cupboard, in my bookcase. So, but I never came to read it, and I think it's actually marvelous. It's one of a book which you keep coming back to understand what really Marcia Gessen wants to do, to understand this, let's say, this tragedy, but also this puzzle of Russia in 1989 in the perestroika, ending the Soviet totalitarian regime, and then in 25 years
basically
reinvented itself again as an authoritarian, as a totalitarian regime. And that's basically what Marcia Gessen is describing. So it's I think one of the books who I would think would put you on a lot of questions, but you think, okay, but we have to look for this and we have to look for that. So how is that possible, so to say? And even if we are now talking about these 10 books and what's in these 10 books, that it's more about understanding Russia than understanding Ukraine in a certain sense. And like you mentioned, just the book of Medvedev, this war on memory, I think in a certain sense, not in a certain sense, also in Marcia Gessen, this is also about the war of memory. So, and so Marcia Gessen is Russian, but lives in the United States. She basically fled Russia in I think in the 21st century in the beginning, but I'm not sure about that. And then She is a historian and journalist and publishes a lot of Russia about Pussy Riot, about the intelligentsia. And this is, I think, a very important book. So what she basically wants to show us, to tell us, I think, is basically two things. And she does it in a wonderful way. So it's also stylistic, a very remarkable book, because he describes this 25 years since 25 years since 1989, and uses the lives of four people. One is Zhanya. She's the daughter of Boris Nemtsov, who was murdered in 2015. And then Zarosha, he is the grandson of one of the ideologues of Perestroika. This is Alexander Yakovlev. And then Masha, she is a daughter of a party official and becomes very well-to-do as a businesswoman. And then Lyosha, he's a young K academic who starts to try to start an academic program in Perm on queer studies. So this is interwoven in these stories, and it's very beautiful done, and very gives you a kind of inside perspective what these four people are dealing with in working their way through in these 25 years of Russian history, so to say. And she walks basically two paths. The first part is like what we already, that's more or less like Russia since the Perestroika is, it's basically the return of the KGB as the only state organ who's still in charge, so to say. And with that, the oligarchs and Putin and so on. And that's basically the state part of this reclaiming of totalitarianism, with Putin becoming a president for life and installing the repression again, and that's all. And also, by the way, for instance, this killing of Boris Nemtsov. So that is one part. But maybe the most interesting part is the other part of the book. And this is about, because Putin is not the only one to blame. That's more or less the message. And the other part is the kind of agency, the kind of mentality, the kind of people who are bred by this totalitarian history, the longest totalitarian history in the 20th century. And Yuri Levada, he's one of the first who was a social investigator already in the 80s and in the 90s of last century of this personality type. That's like the authoritarian personality, what Adorno and Horkheimer did in the United States in the war. But Levada came up with according to the term Homo Sovieticus, as a kind of personality type. What is necessary to make totalitarianism to survive. So you have to be on distance from the state. You have to be like my good friend Bogdan said in Lviv. We don't say what we think, and we won't do what we say. And then not getting involved in politics, not getting involved in anything what can hurt you, and what, in a certain sense, makes totally sense when you have to survive in a totalitarian society. So. But then Levada thought, well, this Homo Sovieticus will disappear in the next decade or so. And to the surprise of one of his employees, and now also one of the well-known sociologists, that is Lev Gudkov, in investigations apart after that, that didn't happen. So the Homo Sovieticus wasn't actually disappearing, wasn't falling apart, so to say, but was still in place. And that was really a surprising thing. And actually, Gudkov said, well, this Homo Sovieticus is not only surviving, but it is also reproducing itself from generation to generation. And I think this is a very important thing to think about, and made me think about. So how can that happen? Because this is really a kind of what you say, miracle is basically the wrong word to say that, but it's really something puzzling. that when you are surviving basically as the Homo Sovieticus, a murderous regime, or especially in this 30s and after the Second World War, and then you are surviving the Soviet Union, instead of finding the road to liberty, you again started to dance, so to say, like the Homo Sovieticus. And I think this was for me, in a sense, what made this book for Marcia Keston. She describes this basically, how this happens, and what the kind of different particles, what the kind of pieces of the puzzle are, what to see what happens, or what happened then. I don't think there is really an explanation what she is looking for, but simply, and I think that it's also what made the books powerful, that she tries to see, to describe, like Hannah Arendt did. I want to see, and I want to describe to understand. And I think Marcia Keston did a very good job with that, and including producing questions for me, to understand what happened there.
Mm-hmm. I think we will talk a lot about Russia in this story with the books, because this is a Ukrainian-Russian war, and to understand what is happening, you really have to understand Russia. Yeah. And that is just, this we were too close, and because of this too painful for these two nations, it's how you call this, like twins that were born together. Mm-hmm. At some point they have to be separated because they are different, but some of these two is really trying to stay in the situation and not to move anywhere. So this is important to understand our situation.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think what you once said, something that's very important. We shouldn't look too ideologically at what's happening in Russia. And that's basically one of the dangers of wars, that you look at it from an ideological point of view, so a condemning point of view, and it's rightly so. So that's one of the things, of course, that you have to do. But on the other hand, you have to see what happens. So there's also a bit of the critique on Marcia Keston, that she actually looked at the social surveys, and so it doesn't look at what people really think. So one of the critics said that, I'm not sure if they're totally fair, but I'm very much in favor of that. Try to understand this immensely complicated history of Russia since 1917.
And now, talking about not trying to look at things ideologically, this is a book written from Russia, from inside. And for many people who are today on the Ukrainian side, this is not a very pleasant book, because it also, the second part of the book is about the contemporary events after 2014, and it tries to explain the situation from the side view, from the view side of the Russian viewer. The author of this book is Sean Walker. Sean Walker is the journalist. He worked almost 2 decades describing Russia or Central European countries, as he says, for The Guardian, Observer, and The Independent. And this book is a more almost like a journalist report. He's trying to understand what is happening to Russia. And the title of the book, The Long Hangover, is actually an allusion to the story that Russia woke up after a party, and after being in a party and drunk for a long time, and then you had to clean up the mess after yourself, but it was too tired and it really didn't feel like cleaning anything, and then it just fell into sleep again. So what the idea of that Sean is having. Sean is actually a graduate of the Oxford University. He was studying Slavic and Russian studies, Russian history, history of the Soviet Union. And so when he was writing this book, he was traveling around Russia. He was also living in Moscow for a while, but then he even traveled to Donbass. He was talking to these people who were starting the war in Donbass on the side of the Russia, not the Russia, but the Donbass, so to say, the Donbass people. But the people who really were Russian militaries and Russian former officers. And he's trying to make sense of what was happening to Russia. He says that the whole thing was the Russia that after this failure of the Soviet Union, Russian people were deprived of sense and purpose in their life. They kind of lost the idea why are they existing. So the whole thing is explaining how Putin is trying to make Russia great again, and it has like 4 parts. And these the title of the 4 parts are very interesting because they are also they return us back to Masha's Gassen book, because it's also about how the past becomes the future. The first part is the curating the past. It's about how Putin was trying to restore the Soviet mythologies, the Soviet past in the Russians' ideology, Russian present. Then the second is about the present. It's about Putin's how Putin is living, what he's doing to Russia right now. The third part is when the past becomes the present, and the fourth part is the past is the future. But what is happening here? By traveling to different parts, what happens to the author, what Walker notices, he notices something that the Russians don't notice. He talks to the people who have become victims of the regime, but they are also in the same time are the perpetrators. Mm-hmm. And he talks also about Crimea and Ukraine in that sense. He says that Ukraine is not far away from Russia, that it's kind of like a mirror of the this Russian lost identity, this desire for sovereignty. But the sovereignty is understood here as as a kind of like a meaning for the state to exist. And in this oppositions, he's trying to explain that the Russia is developing between this, always about between the oppositions. For example, between memory and shame, between monies and principles, Ukraine and Russia. These are like the oppositions that are creating this center, the core of the Russian contemporary identity. But it's controversial, but it's also interesting to read because it gives you kind of like an internal view from the inside, trying to really sincerely understand what is happening in the Russian brains.
Yeah, interesting, because this almost this paradoxical aspects of this Russian mind in that sense. I think that is a very important thing to understand what it is, and what I think maybe we come that to our next book, but one of the things is what happens if you look at it from like just from the perspective of the state. That means that there is no agency for a normal Russian man or woman, so to say. So and it's definitely there, and you have to uncover it to discover what's so hard. So it's difficult to say in these times, but what's so hard for Russians, and maybe also for Ukrainians. I think Sean Walker has some point there. to come to terms with your own history. When it is, so this is not the time to do that for Ukrainians, I suppose, but by that it won't disappear. And that's basically what it is. When you don't come to terms with it, it keeps coming back.
Exactly.
Charles Clover, Black, White, White Snow. Well, we just had our Don't Give Up Ukraine on Orysya a couple of weeks ago with Andreas Umland and with Hubert Smeets and so. But I choose this book because this is a book because I heard about Eurasianism, also about some of our earlier guests. It was Jaroslav Ritsak, and it was our German friend Hulse. And it makes me very curious about that. So what actually is about Eurasianism and why it's important to understand for us what Eurasianism is all about. And this book is, I think, one of the best books to understand what Eurasianism in the 20th century is, which are the meanings of Iranianism in the 20th century. So there's a couple of things that I think it's a very good book. So the first thing, it's very detailed. So it's really, there is no one Eurasianism. So like Clover explains, we have this first stage of Eurasianism was basically conservative, ethnic-oriented ideology, and basically came up by the pen of the Russia diaspora, Russian refugees in the 20s. So it's about Trubetskoy, it's about Roman Jacobson in Prague. So the idea was that there is a kind of vocation for Russia as a civilization, but makes it different from Europe, from the liberal tradition, the liberal civilization in Europe, and that this civilization, this Russian civilization, is ethnic, is worthwhile to explore, and gives a kind of an agenda for the future of Russia. So this is one thing. And by the way, this was the huge diaspora after the First World War. There were about 2 million Russians who are basically fled Russia. So it's also an interesting thing. And then there was, of course, Lev Gumilev. He was the son of Anna Akhmatova, who also, he was in the Gulag and also writing about this more ethnic and ethnic view of Eurasianism, but why it became a part of our current history is about Alexander Dugin and his guys. So he was on the far right in Russia and a very productive writer for some very popular also in the right wing European parties, among them in the Netherlands, so to say. He has this agenda to think about Orysya and the Russian vocation, the Russian message, the Russian goals in the world in becoming indeed this empire based on a geopolitical logic and dominating a huge part of the world, so to say. And it's actually what Charles Clover is actually showing in the beginning, very provocative, and of this book is listening actually to a speech of Putin in 2018, I think, something like that. And it discovers some words what Putin were using was basically coming from the vocabulary of Alexander Dugin. And this Eurasianism is an extremely, I would say, aggressive ideology. It's in a certain sense fascist. It's again a project for a Leviathan, so to say, which you could say it's like a program for a totalitarian state. So, and that's actually what Charles Clover is describing, and I think it's one of the pieces of the puzzle to understand what's really happening now in Ukraine. And what motivates some of maybe Putin. Now we had in our own discussion here on Don't Give Up Ukraine Andreas Umlaut doubted that and said, well, basically Eurasianism is a kind of more pragmatic and a more economic motivated program. What's also one of the types of this ideology. But I think still it's important to read this book, and it's very readable. And it gives you a kind of perspective on what's happening in Ukraine and in Russia. It's basically scary if you read it. So I recommended it to someone else, and he said, "Well, I'm reading it now," or was it she? And he said, "Well, it really make me scared of reading it," and it should, because if this is really true and if this is happening, this is not the end game yet.
Yeah. By the way, the books that we mentioned earlier also write about the speech of Putin in 2018. And another event that is mentioned also is Olympic opening of the Olympic Games 2014. Mm-hmm. The visual image that was behind the opening of the Olympic Games, as well as the Putin speech in 2018, has the same line. It's the line of this empire coming from the ashes.
Yeah, and it's basically an answer to one of the questions you addressed just about the book of Sean Walker, is about making sense of lives again, so to say. Give it a kind of direction and a sense. And Eurasianism is basically a program to do that.
Okay, and now really about scary books and also very interesting books. This is Svetlana Alexievich, it's actually a Belarusian author from Belarus, and she got a Nobel Prize in 2015. She is also a journalist, and she writes oral history. Her father, I think, yes, one of her parents, I don't remember whether father or mother, is here from Western Ukraine, and her other parent is from Belarus. And she was writing, in her books, she was trying to understand the Soviet past, the Soviet history through its key events, through the Afghanistan, through Chernobyl, through the failure of Soviet Union, through the Second World War. So her major books are like this. But this one is heavy because it's a book built on personal stories. It's almost a phenomenology of this Russian Homo Sovieticus. Trying to understand Homo Sovieticus, this experience from inside. And when I was looking into different websites, what people think of this book, there are two types of reactions. People who are deeply into the Soviet culture are really refusing it. Mm-hmm. Because they say it's not really showing this bright side of our past. It's showing the scary stories. It's showing the fear that the Soviet people were filled in with. It's showing that this machinery of the totalitarian system. It's showing how the Soviet people were absolutely unable to perceive the other. They were so scared of anybody else because the fear that was penetrating their life actually poisoned their minds. But then for the people who don't know this epoch, it almost looks so distant and so, it's like really a story not about them. So it's really the people who are in this, who really belong to this epoch, they say we don't like it, and the people who were not in this epoch also say we don't like it because this is. It's really trying to understand, unlike, I think, from what is making difference from the previous books, they are more like analytical. They are from the, they're trying to understand the inside, but the authors are kind of like explaining it like an object. And she is explaining it really from the inside, from the perspective of the people who lived through this. And it's also it has two parts. It first is explaining the period of 91 to 2001, and the second is from 2001 to 2013. 2012, 2013, this was published in, and it was actually translated in many languages. Now, I think in 2019, Svetlana Alexievich became the head of the Belarus pen club. Right? Is that, yeah? But because of her, because of her position on, she really is from inside Belarus. She's not taking very much, with the big support, of course, considering Lukashenko's regime. So I think this is, I think it's really a phenomenology of this Homo Sovieticus. That's what this book is about.
Interesting. And what's also interesting is, of course, these two reactions to this book, not want to accept this. So it makes it a part of the history it describes, so to say. So because it provokes something what is hard to swallow somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And that's...
but it's really very little of her own, She only writes down the stories that are told by other people, and this is really hard to swallow. That's it. It's really hard to face in your own pains.
Yeah, it's really hard to face your own pains. Yes, I agree with that, and that well, maybe brings us to our next book. This is, I had another one in mind, but doesn't matter. So I had in mind that we would now talk about Atkin, but this is the last one I'm reading now. So and it's actually about the same what you are discussing now. It's about it's a book of Jochen Helbeck. He's a professor at Rutgers University in the United States. And this is a book about, I don't know, 2011? I'm not sure about it. But it's called Writing a Diary Under Stalin. And the title is Revolution of My Mind, and it is writing a diary under Stalin. And it's a very amazing book, so to say. And so what made me think about Atkin, that Atkin is in its concept of warp mourning, says, well, it's a kind warp mourning is a kind of double mourning. It's about mourning for the lost lives, but it's also mourning for lost ideals, so to say. And this book is basically about the time when the ideals were not yet lost, but were basically on the brink of getting lost. So what amazes me, and it's about the diary, but what I didn't know, and what amazes me, that there was really a kind of an urgency after 1917 and in writing diaries in the Soviet Union. And it became also a policy of the Communist Party, who encouraged writing diaries. So and writing diaries meant that the diaries, there was several stages. And the first stage was more mechanical, how you became a part of the history of building up a cog in the machine of the Soviet Union, so because it has to be reconstructed and so on. And the second part was not so much the outward reconstruction of Russia, of the Soviet Union, but it was the inward reconstruction of the Russian employees, the workers, and so on, women, men, and so on. So they started asking the questions and writing them down, in a sense, how to become a good communist, and how to overcome your bourgeois predicament, so to say, especially for intelligentsia. And for the normal people, it was how to become from a kind of an animal to a new man. And for the intelligentsia, well, it was like how to develop, how to transform from an old man to a new man. So and it's really it's in a kind of it's really touching to read that. So you're reading a kind of very different history of people living in Russia who are not yet Homo Sovieticus, so to say, and so who are really living there for ideals they admire. So and when you look at these ideals, they're not that strange. These are ideals about equality. It's about ideals of building a more just society. It's about ideals of building a country you can be a nation you can be proud of, so to say. It's about rebuilding and recreating your own life circumstances of life and so on. So what's so important is not to look at these stories from the knowledge we have now. So that's an easy thing. So you could think, okay, you're believing that, but it was a rather naive thing to believe, or you shouldn't have believed, or you should have been more on guard. It was like, say, just before 37 and after 37. But it's when this became visible in the diaries that, for instance, if your neighbor is being arrested and sent to the Gulag, if he's lucky, and if he's unlucky, simply gets shot in a Lubyanka or has to make a confession or something, then you think, as writing this diary, that he should be a bad person, because it is impossible that the party and Stalin is wrong in this, because you haven't invested so much energy, so much hopes in this history and so on, that it's virtually impossible to think that your neighbor could be right in somehow, or it could be an unjust arrest. And so it's really something where Marcia Keston is also talking about in a very powerful example in her book. So that's why I think this is a very important book. You have to read it without, well, you have to put up your glasses, and you have to read that as it is. And not as something that you're looking for confirmation for how her history developed after that. But that I also begin to feel a bit sorry for them. So it's like you have to imagine living in a nation when this happens, what Atkins describes, this robbed morning, you're losing your lives and you're losing your ideals. And maybe if you lose your lives and come to terms with it, or for your relatives or whatever, and lose your ideals, then there exists some room for Homo Sovieticus. So a very important book, not very well known, very well written. And really a lot of quotes from these diaries, so to say. And I think very helpful. I think this is something where I'm working on, coming there, something what's like what you said in the last book, what Svetlana was doing, trying to see what's really going on in the soul of the people. One of the titles of a chapter is Laboratories of the Soul. So Michel Foucault would have loved this book somehow. And I think you all will have misread it in a certain sense. So it's a book about creating a civilization that's going to fail.
That's quite interesting, It's interesting how this always fascinates me, how this story went all wrong. Was it doomed from the beginning, or was there some mistake somewhere in the middle? But my guess is that there was something really corrupted from the beginning. Reading the stories of the Lenin and other leaders of the Russian Revolution, but I really also admire the stories of the people who were idealists, who really believed in this new brave world that they are creating.
Yeah, and you have you're quite right, because I think it was wrong from the beginning. If you look at the language, like struggle, like being hard, like and this all these kind of things, that's a real Bolshevik, so to say, in a certain sense, merciless, and so and don't have any compassion for someone who is not thinking like you. And so I think there was something wrong from the beginning. That's totally and only confirmed by the terror. Basically, I think that's true. What you say about that.
Now let's talk about what was there wrong from the beginning. Let's talk about Alexander Atkin, Warp Morning. We had him as our guest, and maybe you tell a few words, and then I'll share also my thoughts.
Okay, let's do that. So first of all, this is it's not an easy read. Let me say that from the start. So it's what I very much like of the book is that it's also one of the book of deconstruction, I would say. And so in the sense that it deconstructs an easy reading of Russian and Soviet history. So, for instance, that there didn't take place any mourning about losses in the Gulag in Russia, and all that kind of thing. That's, I think, not true. What's basically one of the messages of the book, what really struck me, and also from other books from Atkin, is this, what I would say, the difference between the totalitarianism of the Nazis and the totalitarianism of Stalinism. So, somewhere in his book, I think Atkin uses the term the Gulag as suicide, and that makes this, so that for me this makes this Soviet Russian history so immensely complex, because unlike the German history in the Nazis, that was like exterminating the Jews, we can consider as a ethnic alien people, and so you're basically destroying, playing genocide of something what's not you as a German ethnic Germans. And the story of Stalinism and of the terror, it's a very different story. That is the suicide on your own people. And I think Sean Walker referred to that, the suicide on your own people. And it means that you are not killing some other ethnic group, but you are killing your own, and arbitrarily killing Russians by Russians. And so that's one of the things. What I think it's one of the main themes, and which is so much difficult, so difficult to get into terms to really mourn about this part of the history of this very difficult and tragic part of Russian history, because well, not everyone, but a lot of Russians are basically complicit in this story. So you are the first day you were a perpetrator and you were in Lubyanka and you shot someone, and the next day you were shot yourself. And so that's what the true story of the Stalinist terror. So this is one thing what I think is very important in this book, and the other thing is that Atkin tried to describe in an intergenerational way the different phases of mourning what took place in Russia and in the Soviet Union. For instance, from prisoners from the Gulag getting back to home, they were not dead. They were a kind of undead. They didn't have a name. You didn't know as a family if your father, mother, or someone else was still alive. You did if he was still living somewhere. You probably have thought about he's dead. And then he came off of the Gulag, and after 1953 this happened. And you come back home, and then you are not recognized, so to say. And so this concept of recognition is important for Atkin in his book, and this failure of being recognized and this alienation what this produces, so to say. And this is part of this not being able to coming to terms, not being able to mourn, to regret, and that. But and then the third part is that I think Atkin really follows it not so much as a kind of struggle with collective memory, but what he calls cultural memory. So he follows a lot of people in important artists, writers, movie makers, and so on, like Bakhtin, Andrei Sinavsky, Sveshnikov, a very impressive painter of the Gulag, so to say, Shostakovich, and even his own uncle, Jevgen Atkin, was basically had this experience of not being recognized, and he follows them in their way, their aesthetic way of describing their experience in the Gulag. And for them, the Gulag was the real world, so to say. Even when they were out, the Gulag was the real world. So, and I was wondering if this kind of aesthetic way of thinking at the Gulag, right? This language you use if you want to remember the Gulag, if you want to share this inability to share this experience in the Gulag only on an aesthetic way, not in a moral way, and not condemning. But that's the strange thing. It's not condemned. Even when the people who are in the Gulag, they don't condemn the Gulag. Yeah, of course there are who do. But that's something that Atkin, I think, also shows. That was certainly not a general thing. That was like describing what's hard to describe. What's totally understandable, of course, what it is. But that's also one of these pieces of the puzzle, that the practice of the Gulag, the practice of the terror, killing people by the thousands, has never been condemned in Russia, in the Soviet Union. There's no one who has to stand trial for that. And even like Gutkov showed, in 1917, the most admired leader in the world was still Stalin. So this is amazing. And I think the book of Atkin tried to tell a story. He is self-involved because of his family, but about this experience, going to the experience of the Gulag and trying to mourn, but not being able to do. Why? And that's why the Gulag keeps coming back like something uncanny. Stalin is still sleeping beside you on your pillow. So that's it's immensely rich book to read. And you want to read all these Russian writers. So I have a lot of them now who Atkin describes, and well, in that sense, it's really a Fundgrube, what Germans would say.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now I want to talk about a book that is totally out of the line that we're talking, because it's trying to explain, it's trying to voice Ukrainian side. So far, we were talking about the books where Ukraine was part of the biggest story, but never a subject of its own. It was always an object. And this book is by our guest, Mikhailo Vinnytsky. He is a Ukrainian-Canadian, or Canadian-Ukrainian, he's sociologist and professor of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. And this book is his way to explain what was really Maidan about. And it has two parts. It has a part where he describes the events of the Maidan, because he himself was there. After all, he lived, and he lives still in Kyiv and in the very center, so he was there always. And what were the events? And the second part of this book is the way to analyze it as the scholar, what was happening, the processes that were happening. One of the most important things in this book, I think, is trying to voice Ukrainian narrative from its own side. Because what we usually hear, at least in the recent years after Maidan, is that it was totally orchestrated and created and supported by somebody else. It was not people, so to say, grassroots movement, right? So it was sought out and produced and sponsored by oligarchs or by Russians or by Ukraine, but there was no really an autonomy in there. And so what is Mikhailo is trying to show that this was there was a deep need for, if I could explain this in academic terms, that is Hannah Arendt on revolution. And here is Ukrainian Maidan as the political, as a way to move forward. And he's in his second part, where he's producing, he's trying to produce an analysis of what was happening. He's talking about different stages that the Ukrainian political life went through, the political nation went through, including the postmodern type of politics, and then this recent development, really creating like a political unity, a political body, then autonomous subjects of its own. So I think this is really important book. If we were talking about, so far we're trying to get back and to understand what is happening on the Russian side, I think this is one of the first books that is trying to voice the Ukrainian side, trying to move forward with the what is happening for Ukraine. By the way, we have few books on our list that we want to describe also a Ukrainian narrative. Maybe we have to return to this again, so our viewers don't think we just support or we want to show only Russian side. But I think it's also really important to understand Russians. And now we still move. Now we finish with the Ukrainians. I don't know, this is my favorite novel this year. Would you say a few words about this, since we both read it?
Totally agree with that. And I totally also agree with the last thing you said. So we don't want to be accused to be only interested in Russia, so to say. I don't know. But you're right. But I think this one of the things why it is so important, and also the book of Renitsky, what you said showed, is that, well, let's go back a bit to this Homo Sovieticus. It's a kind of agency. Yeah? It's a kind of way of making yourself fit for a kind of system to work, so to say. And this return of Homo Sovieticus, what Kudkov was saying to is one way of let's say, getting rid of getting in a post-totalitarian narrative and state, so to say. And Ukraine, and that's, I think, why this is so important to talk about both of them, is somehow developing a different path coming from the same history, so to say. Yeah, sharing the same history of totalitarianism in the 20th century and so on. Also different, but of course, that's what it is. So, and that's why it's so interesting to see and so important to see what's actually this different path is. So I quite agree with you what you said and what Renitsky said about this new beginning. I feel like it's a wonderful way to put it. This revolution, making a new beginning, and not once, but doing this, making this new beginning in 1990. Of 1991, doing this in 2004, 2014, and again doing this today. So making again this new beginning, so to say. Always very painful, always very hurtful, always with well, now of course with a lot of bloodshed, which you really want to avoid. But it's also a kind of carving out a different kind of agency, so to say. An agency, what it's actually develop a kind of new kind of a different kind of living. And then I come back to Sergei Sadan, because I quite agree with you. I read the book a couple of months ago, and I think it's a mind-blowing book. It's very good. It's about 2014, basically, of 2015. So it's about the Donbass, where his protagonist, Pasha, is living. And Pasha was a guy who tried to keep out of trouble every time. So he lived.
Politics, to be precise.
What do you say?
He was trying not just to be keeping out of trouble, but he was trying to avoid politics.
Yes, and he was trying to avoid politics and saying this is not of, I don't have to make my choices. And then there's one passage in the book was really, and Pasha is, the book is about, it's about the war in the Donbass. And it's about the separatists and the Russians who are making progress then. And a cousin of Pasha is basically in the internat or in the orphanage in a town near a city nearby, so to say. And Pasha decided that he had to get his nephew back, so to say. So he's going there. And then the story develops even in layer after layer after layer, I would say, where what's really, it's a kind of, you could say kind of a mini Bildungsroman in the sense that there's all kind of a transformation taking place inside Pasha, but not voluntarily, so to say. So there's one passage in the book. It's about a discussion with the director, a lady of the orphanage of the internat. She's called Valera. And Pasha says, well, we are ordinary people and we are ordinary people have nothing to do with the war. I'm reading that because it's been, and she reminds him, Valeria reminds him that they never voted. He never voted, never took an active interest in the civil society. And you should have taken sides. You should have made up your mind and taken sides long ago, she tells him. And you're so used for hiding, so used to staying out of things, letting someone else decide everything for you. Nobody's going to decide for you. Nobody's going to take care of things. Not this time, she says, because you saw what was going on. You knew, but you kept silent. You didn't say anything. Nobody's going to judge you for that, obviously, but don't count on your descendants' appreciation. This is, a key moment in the book when I think Jerzy Žadan, so one of the famous writer, I think, of Ukraine today, got the Deutsche Friedenspreis recently. So, and this is for me a kind of scene. So in the sense that he comes up with a message and also with so very powerful and can be felt today. So we also have today people who say, also in the Netherlands, where I'm talking from, that this is not our war. So we don't have to take sides. You have to listen to both sides. It's just a lack of judgment and a lack of courage. And that's a lack of seeing yourself as a citizen, I would say. And that's what Valeria explains to Pasha. And I hope that this is what we're actually going through, but also what Ukraine is actually going through from 1991 to 2004 to 2014 and 2022. So it's of course, this is a very political way of reading it. And so what I'm doing, because it's very exciting read, I would say, and it really moves you. So even in the last part of it, when Pasha is trying to be a nurse for soldiers at the front and so on, well, you could sleep for that if you read it. So, but that's what
a really good book. Yes, if you get it, be aware that you will not be able to finish to go to sleep before you finish the reading.
Yeah.
And it's captivating, and it's only three days of the war that are described in there.
Yeah, it's only 3 days, actually, as you're saying. Yeah. So why do you think it's so powerful?
I think this is you just brilliantly explained. It's actually closely related to the previous book, to Maidan. It's about these people who are taking responsibility for their lives and get into politics, and people who are not taking the responsibility and they are trying to stay away because it's dirty, and in the end they get dirty themselves because if you don't get into the politics gets into you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and let's finish our review with our last book. It's a book written by Ukrainians for the Western audience. That's what it says in the introduction. It's 16 essays by Ukrainian sociologists, historians, philosophers, writers, very famous people. And some of them are really our friends, like Yaroslav Hrycak, Andruchovich, Karpa, Vakhtan Kebuladze is my colleague and a Ukrainian philosopher, Hanna Shelest, Volodymyr Yermolenko is another philosopher, Andrei Kurkov is a writer. And it's 16 essays composed in 8 parts. So each part is dedicated to a certain topic. And it has 2 essays that are showing a different perspective on the same topic. The first is stories. It's called or histories. It's actually histories. It's 2 the 2 essays. One is by Yaroslav Hrycak giving a big picture on the history of Ukraine, and Serhiy Plokhy, interview with Serhiy Plokhy trying to explain Cossacks and medieval and early modern Ukraine, how it influenced the contemporary narrative. The second part is called Identities. Identities is the interview with the famous Ukrainian writer Yuri Andruchovich, who also receiver of many prizes for literature, and another Ukrainian writer who writes only in Russian called Andrei Kurkov. And they're almost like the black and white, right? One has never written in Russian and another has never written in Ukrainian. So this is trying to show this face of Ukraine. Then the third part is called Archetypes, and Archetypes is given to whom would you think? To philosophers, of course. The first essay is by Andriy Bodnar about the Ukrainian nepovnota. Nepovnota is the word for not being full, not being like finished. And then Volodymyr Yermolenko, a Ukrainian philosopher, writing about Ukrainian empire, about a steppe, Ukrainian life in the steppe. It's like an endless field, like where we cannot see the horizons. And then about empire and about the cruelty that has become a part of the Ukrainian history. The fourth part is stories. It's a most personal part. It's the stories it's a personal stories by Irena Karpa and Haska Shiyan. These are Ukrainian writers, young and very provocative, and I think very fun to read. Then the part called it's a Motherland. Motherland, it's about Vakhtan Kebuladze and Larissa Denisenko. Larissa Denisenko is the Ukrainian writer and lawyer, and she writes about the post-Soviet kind of like a relation of Ukrainians to their Soviet and post-Soviet homeland. And Vakhtan Kebuladze is a philosopher who is also of Georgian. He's Ukrainian Georgian, so he's trying to explain how important for Ukrainians were the independency and what happened in Maidan. Then, very important part. It's a six collection. 6 part is called Wounds. we were talking today about violence. These are about Crimea and Donbass, and these essays by two people. One is Alim Aliyev from Crimea. He is a representative of Crimean Tatars. He's one of the activists of the Crimean Tatar community, and another is Volodymyr Rafeyenko, who is a Ukrainian writer from Donbass, and for whom the Donbass have become a real, it's a real wound of his life. And the seventh part of the book is about relations. It's about relations with different nations. And there are two essays. One is writing about Oleg Nityuk is telling about Ukrainian-Polish relations. And another one is Leonid Finberg, is a Ukrainian Jewish scholar, and he was a founder and the first rector of the Jewish University in Kiev, and he is also a founder of a Ukrainian publishing house called Ducha and Litera. A great man, big activist, and they're telling their stories of how different ethnicities and different ethnic groups. How is that to be a Ukrainian majority in the country where you were the entire history you were a minority, and then you all of a sudden have become majority? That's a reflection about this. And then there's eighth part. It's of the essays is stereotypes. Stereotypes is the story, of course, about the stereotypical understanding of Ukraine in the world, and this is about the most popular myth about Ukraine in its relation to Crimea, to Donbass, and toward Russian aggression, and also how Andrei Portnoy, he's Ukrainian professor in the University of Vyadrina, he's trying to understand how stereotypes are, what stereotypes about Ukrainians are in Germany. So this is like trying to give this old, it's almost like, how you call this English word, like somebody is, it's a big horoscope of different.
Kaleidoscope, you mean?
Yes. Of different stories about Ukraine, written for outsiders. They say for the Western audience, but I really think this is not for the Western audience.
Yeah.
I really think this is Ukrainians trying to explain themselves who they are.
Yeah.
And this is really something that happens to now in Ukraine. We are trying to understand, because now we were talking with you about Russia a lot, about the processes in the past and the present, but for Ukraine it's important to understand who we are as a nation, what we want, what is so different, why are we not really Russians. That's a real story. And this book is available online. You can download it for free, both in English and in Ukrainian.
Wonderful.
Good news, you don't have to buy it.
That's a good thing to hear, and I couldn't agree more. So, it reminds me of a saying of Franz Kafka that it's ways are created by going them, and by going them you have to reflect on the steps you were taken. So it's something you don't know what really the next step is. You can also make wrong steps, but you still have to reflect on that. It's very much a part, I think, about the Ukrainian history of the last decades. And so, and this is a very good way to do that, to make this thinking. It also make me think about Hegel. So we had a little discussion about Hegel. There's this saying of Hegel. I know it best in German. Entzweiung ist der Quell der Bedürfnis der Philosophie. It's the Entzweiung. This is going this in two ways. Is the source of the need for philosophy, so to say. And I think that's basically where we are. We as philosophers, and that also the guys who wrote this book, what you just showed, they are really also constructing themselves as a kind of philosopher in reflecting on their own history, and by reflecting, creating the history. So that's so amazing what you are doing today. So
great. I think we had an interesting collection of the books, and I hope some are really interesting for our viewers to have a look at.
Quite agree. And it's also interesting when you talk about the books you've read, and we did in this hour talking about this book, is really you are rethinking the books you've read. And so they became more like a double. So, and it's very important. And I'm very much convinced now, more than when we start. And this is a really 10 books you have to read. So not in one day, not in 1 week, but if you take a year, that's okay, so to say. So thank you again, Orysya, for doing this together. I want to say goodbye to our audience, and we will be here again next week, of course, with another subject. And maybe we will come back with our regular talk about books, because I very much liked to do that. So good evening, until next time.